Okay, Peter, so here we go again, 2022. 2022 had a slightly inauspicious start. The first email that I got in my inbox was from the British Boxing Board of Control on the 1st of January saying all shows in the UK are suspended for the month of January and will resume in February. So a little bit of an inauspicious start, but I'm going to give a prediction here. I think this is going to be a bumper year for boxing. I think it's going to be an incredible year for British boxing, for world boxing, and I'll tell you for why. I'm looking at the amount of fights that we've got lined up. These are not fantasy matches. These are not matches we want to see. These are scheduled fights. I mean, the roster is just incredible. And then also I'm going to go on a bit later on to the fights that I'd like to see in 2022. So looking at this year to start off with, I mean, in January, we were looking at two fights. Callum Johnson against Joe Smith Jr. for the WBO light heavyweight fight. That was supposed to be light heavyweight title. That was supposed to be next week. And Chris Eubank Jr. Versus Liam Williams. Now, the Chris Eubank Jr. v. Liam Williams fight was scheduled for the 29th of January. So that fell foul of the board's rule of suspending all fights in January. So it's been moved to the 5th of February. But that's a great fight. It's a kind of, I think that's a real 50-50 fight. I'm going to edge slightly towards Eubank in that fight. But it's at the Motor Point Arena in Cardiff. It's going to be a very vociferous Welsh crowd, and I think it's going to be a cracker. There's a big grudge match there as well, So I'm really looking forward to that fight. Unfortunately, Callum Johnson has had to pull out of this fight with Joe Smith Jr. Due to catching COVID. Now that was going to be the first British world title or British fighter in a world title fight this year, but I'm hoping that leaves the door open because the WBO #1 contender, that was for the WBO title for Joe Smith, is Anthony Yarde. Now, Anthony Yarde has looked fantastic, in that rematch against Dinton Arthur at the end of last year. Interestingly enough, Yarde is a fighter I think has been made by his defeats. He's had those two defeats against Kovalov. First of all, when he went in against Kovalov, we thought, what's he doing in there? And then obviously when he had that, defeat, stopped in 11 rounds, but really looked on the verge of beating Kovalov, we thought, wow, he deserved to be in there. And then he's come back stronger for that. The defeat from Dinton Arthur, look what he did in the rematch. He seems to be a fighter moulded and made by these defeats and, enhanced, a bit like the old school fighters used to be, rather than, a defeat meaning the end of your career. A defeat for Yarde has meant that he's just moved up a level, moved up a notch. So that's great to see. And then also, I want to talk about scheduled fights, but, we've got that potential for Yarde fighting Joe Smith Jr. But obviously, what about Yarde fighting Buatsi? That's going to be an amazing fight out there, and Dan Azim is in that mix. So really, we've got 4 or 5 world-class light heavies. They're not even going to sort it out who's the best in Britain before they're all challenging for world titles. But that is a fascinating thing to come through. Now, also in February, moving on, we've got Amir against Kell Brook. So maybe a few years too late, but we can find out who wins that. And again, there's a lot of imponderables in that fight. Who's aged the better. So we're going to see who wins that. But there's a cracking fight in February, 27th of February, that I think is flying a little bit under the radar. And that's Lawrence Ocholi against Mikhail Ceslek. Ocholi's third defence of his WBO title. Now Ceslek, these are two guys in their prime. People have overlooked this, but Ceslek is 32. He's had 21 fights, 20 wins. Interestingly, his only loss was when he went to the Congo to fight Ilunga Makabu, who's going to be featuring Canelo's adventures at cruiserweight, in May of this year. But we'll talk about that in a bit. But Ceslek is a great fighter. He's 32. He's in his prime. He's just had that one defeat. He's had 17 knockouts in those 21 fights. Ocholi, we've got really high hopes for. He's 17-0 with 14 knockouts. Like I say, third defence of this title. But to me, this is a real 50-50 fight. It's happening in London. And we've got a little bit of an insight into this as well, because one of our trainers, Darius Scott, our resident sort of pro cruiserweight, is over in Poland at the moment, sparring Ceslek. So we get a bit of an insight. And, I'm speaking with Darius, and Darius is saying, I can't believe how hard this guy hits. He's a real quality operator, and he's really up for this. He's really coming to grab the title. And as I mentioned, with Canelo's adventures in Cruiserland coming up, you never know. If you win this title, you might get the golden ticket. You might get the £10 million fight next, to defend against Canelo. So everything's up for it, grabs in this fight. The cruiserweight division is really sort of set alight by Canelo's move up there. So, we're going to see what happens there. But that's 27th of February, Lawrence Ocholi against Michael Ceslek. And then moving on, these are mouth-watering fights. We've got Josh Taylor, having won that undisputed junior welterweight title, coming back to fight Jack Catterall. Now, people think this is just, he had the big fight and now he's coming back, just to make a sort of mandatory defence in Scotland. But Jack Catterall is a very live opponent, undefeated opponent. I think that's going to be a cracking fight. I do think Josh Taylor is absolute class, and I think he'll win that. But I think it will be a brilliant fight. I think it'll be a late stoppage for Taylor. But either way, it's going to be a great fight. Now, fights that are nearly nailed on, but not quite nailed on. Now we're moving into the realms of the heavyweight, where the fights kind of pop up and disappear like phantoms. But we should be seeing in March or April Tyson Fury against Dillian Whyte. That should finally get nailed on. There's a little bit of arbitration that Dillian Whyte's doing with the WBC, but that should happen. And Oleksandr Usyk v Anthony Joshua with a rematch. Now again, those fights should be coming up. in London. So it's great to see those. And obviously, if we get a Joshua and Fury win in each of those fights, we're going to be set up for the fight of the decade between those two. So that's a really exciting thing for this year. But again, looking around, we've also got Michael Conlan against Lee Wood. A fascinating fight coming up. Lee Wood is looking brilliant, and obviously Conlan we've got very high hopes for. Lee Wood looked great, dominating Kanzu. And also we've interestingly got a clash of trainers in this fight, because Ben Davidson has been training Lee Wood and has obviously really brought him on, and Michael Conlan is trained by Adam Booth. So we're going to have a bit of a tactical battle between the trainers in that fight. And that also plays into another great fight that's being made at featherweight, Josh Warrington against Kiko Martinez. Now, Kiko Martinez obviously stopping Kid Galahad, the old warhorse coming from behind in his last fight. And then Josh Warrington has previously beaten Kiko Martinez on points when Josh was flying high. Now, Josh really wants to get back in the mix, and this is for his old IBF title. But Kiko Martinez will have other ideas, and apparently is very keen for the Josh Warrington fight. Now, as Kiko really enjoying his Indian summer in his career, and is Josh the fighter he was when he beat Kiko on points last time? We're going to find out. And then out of that, Michael Conlan against Lee Wood, Josh Warrington against Kiko Martinez. There's got to be a unification match after that at featherweight to really, find out who's the man. In May, we've got Katie Taylor against Amanda Serrano. Now, this, of all the mouth-watering fights that I've just outlined, if I had to pick one that I was going to go to, it would be this one. Katie Taylor v Amanda Serrano in New York. For all Katie Taylor's titles, this is, last year was great for women's boxing. It really moved the game forward. This fight is really going to up the levels again. I mean, this is the pound-for-pound number one, the pound-for-pound number two, facing off against each other for all the marbles. Doesn't get any better than this. The fight just oozes class. The pedigree is amazing. Like I said, women's boxing has taken on leaps and bounds, and this fight is really going to be a career-defining fight for both ladies, and I think will really move the women's game, forward leaps and bounds as well. So I really can't wait to see that. And also, another fight we've got nailed on in May is Canelo v Makabu up at cruiserweight, as we mentioned on the Cinco de Mayo weekend. So that's going to be, a really interesting adventure for Canelo up there. How's he going to deal with that extra weight? He says he's going to come in about a stone lighter than his opponent. How's he going to deal with the size and everything else? And then, like I say, what then does that mean for the cruiserweight division? Is he going to pay a brief visit, get a title, and go down to light heavy, or is he going to stay there and clean up like he did at super middle? But looking on for some fights that I'd like to see that are not made. So those are all made, and that's really the start of the year. That's why I say it's going to be an absolute bumper year. Teofimo Lopez against Gervonta Davis. I'd love to see those two go out. It doesn't really matter what Lopez has said he's going to move up from lightweight anyway. So wherever this fight is going to be made, that's a cracking fight. Two guys with amazing potential that really need to box each other, I think, to find out who's the best. I'm going to chuck a bit of a curveball in here. I think Joe Joyce against Daniel Dubois. Now, they've both been treading water a little bit. Obviously, Joyce will think he's moved on. He's beat Dubois, and Dubois has had a few run-of-the-mill victories since that fight. But, there's a little bit of a blockage in the heavyweight system, as we've said. And those two going again, I think, just couldn't fail to be an exciting fight. So, I'd like to see that. Conor Benn obviously looked great last year. Interestingly, I'd like to see him against Adrian Broner. I think that's a good fight for him. That's a very winnable fight against a big name opponent that he could move on to. But also, the one that Frank Warren is calling for is Conor Benn against David Avician. Now, that would be a cracking fight. Now, that would be a real 50-50 fight, I think. We would really see, where Conor sits with that one. So, really looking forward to seeing what he does later in the year. And also, we talked about Canelo's adventures at cruiserweight. I would also really like to see him. The best opponent, I think, out there for him is to drop down to light heavy, and Beterbiev, who's an absolute animal. 17 fights, 17 wins. The leading light heavy out there, and all those fights have been kind of bloody stoppages. His nickname is the Beast, and he kind of deserves that nickname. So, Canelo against him, would be amazing. So, I really hope to see that fight. But, it's going to be a really interesting year, Peter. I just think all those fights I've outlined, they're 50-50 fights. They're cracking fights. And this is January. We haven't really made half the fights for the year yet. So, not only, like I said to you at the start of this, the fights that we've got nailed on would make a great year. And the fights that are going to happen, that are out there floating around, it's going to be a brilliant year. And hopefully we'll get some resolution at the top of that heavyweight tree. So I just think it's going to be a bumper 2022. Forget about the suspension. It will get us all the more eager for February. And as long as that goes ahead, we're in for a bumper year. That's my prediction. I can't wait to review the year, even though I'm just previewing it. So I'll speak to you again next week. Thanks, Peter.